In today's video, I'm going to be going over how you make your own router table out of plywood, specifically for the DeWalt D26024 trim router, and all the mistakes that come along with it. This whole router table is going to be made from a single hobby board of plywood with very little waste, so if you want to make one, and you're confident, you'll only need the one board. I'm starting off by cutting the plywood down to size. The first part of the project is the base and the top, so that's what we're going to be cutting here. The two sides on top are the same size, so I cut 3 of the same size piece out first before cutting off some smaller pieces for the feet on the base. Next, I'm attaching the feet to the sides by using some Type Bond 1 and some screws to hold it all together. These feet don't need to be the sturdiest things in the world. I mean, they're just there for the clamps to pin it down the table so it doesn't move around with vibrations. With the sides done, I dry fit the whole assembly together to get an idea for how big the backplate needs to be. As it happens, the spare piece from the earlier cuts fits great, so I guess I'll just use it as it is. I'm going to intentionally leave a gap at the bottom for any power cables to run out behind the box. Next job is prepping the top. The plan is to cut a square recess into the center of the board and fit this aluminium router plate in. This will let me attach the router to the top with some screws, so it won't be going anywhere. This is where the first mistake happens though, and I learned something about routers, or at least the DeWalt router. Plunge routers, i.e. the normal looking ones, have screws in their base about 60 by 70 millimeters apart. This trim router has them at about 60 by 60 apart. This means that the quote universal aluminium plate simply didn't fit my trim router, and I couldn't for the life of me find a 60 by 60 millimeter aluminium plate online. Not for a good price anyway. I decided to try and mount it straight on the wood, but the wood was too thick for the screws, so I just bought some acrylic to make my own plate. I used the original plate as a template for putting the screw holes in the center hole in exactly the right place, before marking a square to use, getting it wrong after checking the router against it and marking a bigger square to cut. Looks like a bit of a mess, but I know what the markings mean, so it's okay. I decided to Forstner out the center hole. It turns out that the acrylic can get warm pretty quick, which seemed to cause the bit to slip around quite easily. The end circle from this looked awful and was hard to get in straight at all. This whole experience wasn't great. Not sure what I would do different here though, so please any recommendations in the comments below. I tried to clean up the hole a little bit with a file, but I only had a square one and didn't really get very far. Next up is drilling the holes for the screws. I need the holes to have a collar on them, and to do that I'll start by drilling a hole halfway through the piece, and then finishing the hole with a smaller bit all the way through. This should leave a collar for the screw to kind of fit against, while being buried into the acrylic enough that the screw head isn't protruding the surface. This whole process was a pain. Apparently the way to work with acrylic is to use slightly dull drill bits, which I wasn't, so I ended up hearing gut-wrenching cracking and popping as I made these holes. One of the collars did end up being a bit of a mess, but the rest were okay, thankfully. With the acrylic plate ready, it's time to carve out the cavity for the plate and the router to fit into the top of the table. I did this by putting the router on the top, centered, and then drew a circle around it. Then another circle around it about 10 mil bigger, so that I can have some clearance. I got the jigsaw out and cut the hole out in one go. This cut doesn't need to be super clean, so I wouldn't worry too much about it being a perfect circle or a perfect cut, so long as the router can slide in and out and the acrylic plate sits safely on the top of the hole. Next, I routed out a 5 mil recess into the top of the board. I did this by setting the routed bit depth to 0, rest the router against the original plate, and then dropped the bit until it barely touched the table. I set up a guiding fence to help me route in straight lines so the edges are nice and clean. I knew the fence had to be a hair under 70 mil to get the edge of the bit to match with the lines that I drew, and I got that from measuring the edge of the plate on the router to the edge of the bit. After the first pass, I tried to fit the plate, forgot I needed to chisel the corner square, fit it again, and it was still a little proud. I set the router a tiny little bit deeper, like less than a millimeter deeper. I did the whole thing again. At this point it was fairly flush, but I used a wooden block to see that there was still a little resistance coming from the top onto the board, because it was still, sitting a little proud. I made one more pass, and in hindsight I really shouldn't have. This final pass made the whole thing about 1 millimeter too deep, and I now have to go off and think about how I'm going to fix this. I'll probably just pack some sheets of paper in there, honestly, so learn from my mistakes. Next up is the fence and the backing thing that lets it slide around. I had a look at the spare plywood that I had left from the sheets and cut out 3 pieces about 2 inches tall, 2 of them for the fence and 1 for the back plate slider thingery-doodah. I glued up the fence pieces and just left them to one side to dry. Next job is fitting the backing plate thingy to the top of the router table. After double checking that the jig set I got myself a year ago is still working just fine, I pulled out 2 T-track screws and 2 screw head twisty boys for the job. I measured the side of the screws and made 2 holes in the backing board the same size as the screws. I drilled the holes in the center of the backing boards and then transferred those holes onto the table so that they lined up perfectly, instead of relying on my crappy tape measuring skills to get the holes in the right spot. After that, I had to route out some grooves in the tabletop so that the screw can freely move along back and forth on the table. I used the hole that I transferred as the start, used that magical just under 70mm rule I figured out earlier, and set up a guiding fence to cut out the groove with the router. I did this in 2 passes so I didn't stress the bit too much. To stop the screw from just spinning forever when we try and screw in the tops, I also needed to add a groove underneath the table so that the T of the screw had something to work against. I used a screw and a pencil to mark out a rough travel path, and used that path with the magic 70mm guide to remove the recess for the T-shaped head. I only had the bit protrude by a couple of mils, so just deep enough to bury the head of the screw. It came out alright, even if I whiffed it a little. Looking good. As a test, I assembled the backing plate with the screws and the screw tops, and it worked really well, so great. Back to the table saw. I forgot to cut some supporting blocks for the fence and for dust collection, so I ran the final piece of scrap through a few times just to get some nice square blocks, cut off some corners for aesthetics, and attached them to the fence and backing board with masking tape. Clamping this together would have been a pain, so I taped it all loosely to get it to fit, and then after gluing it together I taped it harder, faster, better, stronger, and I'd left the whole unit to dry for a bit. I'm attaching the top of the table with some screws and no glue. I suspect I'll want to remake the top at some point or swap it out after it gets damaged or whatever, so I'm only temporarily fixing it in place. I drew some lines on the joints between the side and the top, so if I flipped the board I would see where the two connected. I drilled some holes using those as a guide and then countersunk the tops so that the screws wouldn't sit proud. While the fence is drying, I force-knit out a hole in the dust collection blocks. This hole is rising the bottom of the block because I need the airflow to be as close to the router bit as possible. To get the right size, I simply grabbed my hose, and compared it to the force-knit bit, and went with the one that was just barely smaller than it. I wanted a tight fit over a loose fit. With that block done, I needed to work out where to put it. And this is where another mistake crops up. I forgot to carve out a space for the router bit before assembling the fence. And bleh. I put the fence up against the bit on its highest setting and drew a generous buffer around it so that the biggest bits could fit too. I didn't want this to be massive though, because the bigger the hole, the worse the dust collection is going to be. With that drawn, I take the fence to the table saw and start carving away at the shape, raising and lowering the blade to suit. I couldn't think of a better way of doing this safely, so if you could think of something, let me know down below. I kind of like the effect from the front of the fence, but the underneath's a bit of a mess. At least it's hidden from sight. After the hole was made, I saw that the dust collection block didn't have a big enough connecting hole with the fence, limiting airflow. I decided to carve the bottom out a bit on the dust collection block, and that seemed to open things up by quite a lot. I then glued the dust port onto the back of the fence, assembled the whole table, and decided to give it a spin. I'm so happy I decided to make one of these, if for no other reason than it'll make my fingers safer while trying to work with my page holders, which there's a link in the description if you want one. I'm looking forward to using this router table as part of my normal workflow, and I think it's going to be a wicked good addition. Okay, so on to the mistake summary. Well, this first one is less of a mistake and more of a learning opportunity. I didn't know that universal plates weren't universal, or at least there's a difference between trim router bases and plunge router bases. Numero dos. Drilling into the acrylic plate was a bit nerve-wracking, and the fact that I didn't get 4 clean, strong holes does have me a tiny bit concerned. If I end up using this table a lot, the first thing I'm going to do is replace the plate with a more expensive, actually universal aluminium plate, which costs like 5 times the price. Speaking of the plate, I am gutted I routed too deep a cavity for it in the top of the table. I had trouble pushing a piece through while adding a test chamfer, and it didn't come out very clean. I mean, it's an easy fix, just stuff a few sheets of paper in there to prop it up, but that fix won't last very long, and I'll probably have to remake the top again at a later date, but it's not the end of the world, but it is annoying. Fourth is the height of the cabinet. I planned for it to be 18 inches tall because that's how big the router plus the collar plus that stupid power cable thing came to. And I wanted to have some good room to add and remove the router from underneath. I definitely have plenty of room, but it does make the table a bit awkward to use on top of the bench. Still better than what I had, but it's not perfect. And finally, the fence binds a little bit. This one I can get around quite simply by rerouting those holes a little wider and all will be well, but I had to get this video finished, so I chalked it up as something I'm going to do later, TM. And there you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. If you want to support the channel, the links to do so are down in the description. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.